Deep beneath Vatican City lies a door that guards centuries of hidden truths, files that could shake the foundations of faith. What mysteries slumber behind those iron walls? Tonight we unlock forbidden archives, revealing unsent pleas, suppressed visions, and secret pacts with power. From letters ignored by popes to revelations that could rewrite history, each document tells a tale of faith and fear. Join us on a journey through hidden vaults, where every page holds a secret, and every secret begs the question: what happens when history is written in silence? Chapter 1. The Locked Door Beneath Rome. Beneath the heart of Rome lies a door, heavy, iron, locked. Few ever pass through it. Fewer still know what lies beyond. The Vatican Apostolic Archive is not a place of light. It is a sanctuary of silence, a fortress built not of stone, but of secrets. Its walls stretch beneath the Apostolic Palace, winding through chambers that the public will never see. Generations of popes, bishops, scribes, and spies have added to its contents. Century after century, it has grown not outward but downward, deeper, heavier, denser with truth, or something very close to it. But to understand what hides inside the archive, we must go back. Not just decades, not just centuries. We must return to a time when the Church did not yet know what it was hiding, when scrolls were still copied by candlelight, and men whispered warnings of heresy in cloistered corners. It began with power, not the kind wielded by kings, though many would one day kneel, not the kind born of armies, though banners would be raised in its name. No, this power was quieter, slower. It moved like parchment curling over time. It moved like ink drying in the dark. By the late Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church had become more than a spiritual beacon. It had become a machine of record. Every edict, every letter, every decision passed through scribes. These documents were sacred, not just because they bore the seal of the papacy, but because they were proof, and proof was dangerous. At first, they kept everything in simple chests, locked boxes, wooden coffers, piles of scrolls stacked high in monasteries or tucked into corners of basilicas. But these were not enough. The documents grew in number and in weight, not just the physical weight, but the weight of what they contained. Names of heretics, lists of sins, accounts of bribes, secrets whispered in Latin and written down in careful hands. It wasn't until 1612 that something changed. That year, under the guidance of Pope Paul V, the Church made a decision. No longer would their documents lie scattered or disordered. No longer would knowledge rest in the hands of too many. A new chamber would be created, a true archive, one that was not just for preservation but for protection. Protection from the world, protection from history itself. It was called the Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, the Vatican Secret Archive. But the word secretum did not originally mean hidden. It meant private, reserved, a place meant only for the eyes of the Pope. And that was precisely how it would remain. Doors were sealed. Access was restricted. For over 300 years, almost no one outside the Church could glimpse what lay inside. At first, this was not controversial. Few even knew the archive existed. But as centuries turned and the world began to hunger for truth, the Vatican's silence became its own mystery. What was so dangerous that it had to be locked beneath Rome? What sins of the past had been buried so deep that even time could not unearth them? The answers were not spoken. They were filed. For generations, popes added to the archive. Each left behind their own trail of secrets. Some were small notes on appointments, correspondences with bishops, financial ledgers. Others were far more troubling. Reports from the Inquisition, letters concerning scandals in distant parishes, witness accounts of miracles that had never been acknowledged. And behind all of it was a simple rule. These were not for the public. These were not for scholars. These were for God and the pontiff who served him. Even the way the archive was built seemed to reflect this guarded mentality. The corridors were narrow, lined with dark wood shelves. Manuscripts sat in bound bundles, tied with red string. The air was dry, kept carefully still to preserve the paper. Electric lighting came late. For centuries, the only illumination was candlelight and memory. No one truly knew how large it was. The official line was this: over 50 miles of shelving, more than 35,000 volumes. And that was just what was cataloged. Much of it had no index, no map. If someone were to get lost down there, they would not be found quickly. And perhaps that was the point. Even within the Vatican, only a handful of archivists were granted access. They worked in silence, day after day, decoding centuries-old Latin, deciphering handwriting faded with age. Many documents were so fragile they could not be touched with bare hands. They were crumbling records of things the Church would rather forget. But they couldn't forget. Not really, because memory was the very thing they were trying to preserve. A memory not of holiness, but of control. One story, often told in hushed tones, concerns a document discovered behind an unmarked door in the 18th century. It was a parchment, nothing more, but it bore the seal of a long-dead pope and described an event no longer acknowledged by the Church. A secret conclave, a disputed succession, a moment when two men claimed the throne of St. Peter. The document was quickly resealed, filed, buried again. There were others, whispered stories of letters from condemned priests, confessions written in code, documents that described visions, possessions, or worse, failures. Because the Vatican Archive is not just a place where victories are preserved. It is where mistakes go to sleep, not erased, never destroyed, simply hidden. But the world beyond Rome was changing. Revolutions swept through Europe. Empires fell. Libraries burned. But the archive endured. It stood like a mountain beneath the surface, unmoved, untouched, until, in 1881, something happened that would shake the very foundation of Vatican secrecy. Pope Leo XIII opened the archive, not to everyone, not to the public, but to a select group of scholars, historians, theologians, men of letters who had begged for access, promising to handle the materials with care. For the first time in history, outsiders walked the halls of the archive. They saw its enormity, they saw its depth, and they began to understand that what had been hidden was not just history. It was power. Still, access was tightly controlled. Only a handful of researchers were allowed at any time. They could request specific documents, but only if they knew exactly what they were looking for. They could not browse. They could not wander. The locked cabinets remained locked, and so the mystery endured. In time, myths began to grow. Some believed the archive held the bones of saints. Others said it contained the proof of alien contact. Some whispered of books that predicted the end of the world. These were fantasies mostly, but they fed on the silence. They thrived in the shadows. Meanwhile, within the archive, the quiet continued. New popes added their own layers of secrecy. Documents were stored covering the church's position during times of war. Files were created to track internal dissent. Cases of abuse, cases of betrayal, records of deals struck behind closed doors. And through it all, the archive never made a sound. There were no announcements.
No summaries.
Only dust and ink and silence. By the turn of the 21st century, pressure mounted. The world demanded transparency. Historians called for access. Survivors of scandal pleaded for truth. The church responded slowly, carefully. Bits and pieces were released. Certain collections were opened, sometimes years after the pope who created them had passed. But the heart of the archive remained locked. To this day, only scholars with advanced degrees, clear credentials, and written approval may enter. They are watched, monitored, tracked. They may not take photographs. They may not handle materials freely. They may not speak of what they find until it is reviewed. And the question remains, what still lies hidden behind that locked door beneath Rome? What truths sit in silence, waiting to be found? As the candlelight flickers over parchment, and the hum of the dehumidifiers replaces the old breath of centuries, one thing is certain. The archive is not just a place. It is a statement, a declaration that some knowledge must be kept close, that history, when too heavy, should not be carried by all, that silence is not absence but control, and in that silence, the Vatican Archive waits. But before we continue, let me know if you're enjoying this kind of long, gentle history. Feel free to tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly love what I'm doing here. And in the comments, share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your city. I always love seeing our little bedtime crew gathering from every corner of the world. Now, lower your lights. Maybe let a soft fan hum in the background and settle in. Let's proceed with tonight's quiet journey together. Chapter 2, Heresy, Ink and Chains. The faint scrape of quills on parchment once echoed through empty corridors. Centuries ago, the church stood as judge and jury. It wielded power over souls. It bore the burden of truth. Yet it feared the very knowledge it preserved. That fear gave birth to new chambers in the depths of the archive. Chambers of ink and iron. Chambers of confession and condemnation. Chambers where heresy was recorded as carefully as doctrine. Heresy was a word heavy with danger. It meant more than false belief. It meant revolt. It meant chaos. It meant the threat of division in Christendom. The church saw heresy as a poison. It moved in whispers. It spread in secret meetings. It found refuge in small towns and hidden monasteries. And when it was discovered, it was dragged into the light by men in black robes and iron chains. The archives became the final destination for every case. Not just the verdict, the entire trial. Reports from inquisitors, notes on witnesses, copies of letters smuggled across borders, lists of names, some condemned, some acquitted, all stamped with the mark of suspicion. Each paper bore evidence of fear, fear of ideas that might topple authority, fear of words that might liberate minds. It began in earnest in the 13th century. Pope Gregory IX established a permanent papal inquisition. Its purpose was clear: find heretics, root them out, and record their fate. The archives grew more urgent, more secretive. They began to gather documents not only from Rome, but from every corner of Europe, from France to Spain, from Italy to Germany. Inquisitors wrote volumes in Latin, Old French, German dialects, even in Spanish. All were funneled beneath the Vatican's foundations. Imagine a dark room. A single candle flickers on a desk. A monk leans forward. His face is gaunt, his eyes bloodshot from hours of reading. He holds a stack of parchments, each one a confession, each one a plea for mercy. He copies them into a ledger. He ties them with red ribbon. He stamps them with wax. Then he slides them into a wooden box and locks it. One more secret buried. Some records describe gruesome scenes. Men and women tied to stakes. Flames cracking through night air. Inquisitors taking notes on their reactions. Victims screaming for divine mercy. The records do not flinch. They report. They describe. They catalog. Every crime against the Church. Every denial of faith. Every act of defiance. Yet for all the brutality, a strange reverence lingers in the archive's walls. The documents are witnesses, silent but present. They attest to the Church's struggle to maintain unity. They bear witness to its darkest hours. And they serve as proof that even institutions built on salvation can descend into violence. Over time, the Inquisition evolved. It shifted from mass burning to secret hearings. Torture was still used, but less publicly. Victims no longer marched to the square. They were led into hidden chambers, their cries muffled by thick walls, their confessions taken under duress, their sentences decided by cardinals who never left Rome. All these files passed through the Archivum Secretum. Some survived. Some vanished. Fires, floods, neglect. Yet more than enough remained to fill corridors after corridors of shelving. Each shelf guarded by archivists who had taken oaths of silence. Their eyes scanned centuries of faded script. Their fingers traced lines written by hands long dead. One vault contains hundreds of bound volumes known as the Malleus Maleficarum collection. They hold records of witch trials across Europe. Women accused of communion with demons. Men accused of hurting spirits. The Church documented every accusation. Every piece of evidence, hair, fingernails, laces of witchcraft. Some volumes note handwriting in margins, simple sketches of circles and Latin verses. They speak of prayers meant to bind the accused. They reveal the Church's own superstitions. The files reveal that many of the accused were not witches at all. They were healers. They were midwives. They were women who dared to know herbs and to help their neighbors. Their records are heartbreaking in their innocence. A ledger entry might read of a woman who cured fevers, then accuse her of poison, then condemn her for a crime never proven. The archivists preserved every step, every detail. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the archive lies a different set of files, those of the Trail of the Templars. In 1307, Pope Clement V ordered the arrest of the Knights Templar. They were once champions of Christendom, guardians of pilgrims, holders of vast wealth. Yet suddenly they became the greatest heretics of all. The archive holds copies of tribunal records, accusations of secret rituals in dark chapels, of idol worship in hidden crypts, of blasphemous ceremonies that mocked the cross. Historians peered at these documents when the archives opened to scholars. They found inconsistencies, witnesses who recanted, torture reports, pressure applied until confessions appeared on parchment. But the records remained. They showed how power could warp justice, how fear could rewrite faith, and how the Church used its own procedures to conceal its doubts. In the same cavernous vault sits an even older collection, papal bulls condemning particular books, works by philosophers, scientists, and writers deemed too dangerous. Dante's Divine Comedy was once threatened. Scholars debated Copernicus's theories inside papal chambers. The archive holds the lists of banned texts, the precise passages to be struck, the names of translators burned at the stake, every letter of censure recorded in careful script. As printing spread across Europe, the Church moved faster. It set up networks to intercept printed pages. It sent alerts to bishops. It dispatched inquisitors to examine presses. And every intercepted copy was catalogued, each plate of type analyzed, each printer's name noted, a network of persecution recorded in the vaults below the Vatican. Yet even within these files, contradictions appear. Some censored works were quietly allowed. Some authors escaped punishment. Some books reemerged under new titles. The Church's own scholars sometimes smuggled banned texts back into its libraries. These acts of defiance appear in marginal notes. They speak of quiet resistance, of men who believed that truth would prevail, even if it had to hide in plain sight. All of this shaped the archive's character. It was not merely a chest of secrets. It was a battleground of ideas, of power, of faith. Every document was a witness to conflict, and every conflict was a test of authority. By the 17th century, the archive grew too large for its original vaults. New wings were carved into the rock, new shelves erected, some corridors stretched for miles. Monks and scribes moved between chambers, passing by doorways that led only deeper. They wore simple habits. They carried lamps. They spoke in whispers. They never spoke of what they saw. In 1622, under Pope Gregory XV, the Roman Inquisition was reorganized. It separated crimes of faith from political offenses, created new files, new systems. The archives were updated to reflect this bureaucratic overhaul. Records were cross-indexed. Names were classified by crime. Documents were numbered and categorized. An entire wing became dedicated to political trials, accusations of treason against secular rulers. It showed how the Church's fear of dissent extended beyond mere theology. Meanwhile, in another wing, secret archives grew around the question of mysticism. Reports on heretical visions, accounts of prophecies deemed false, writings of mystics like Catherine of Siena deemed suspicious. Their works were revised, portions blacked out, some books removed entirely. The archive held both the praises and the condemnations, side by side, as if to remind future generations that faith and fear often walk the same path. For centuries, the archive remained sealed. Only a handful of cardinals knew its true size. Even fewer had read its most sensitive files. They carried these secrets to conclaves, to papal elections. They whispered of them in private councils. Yet the world outside only heard rumors. Tales of forbidden books and secret trials. Stories of popes who burned letters in the middle of the night. Whispers of chained doors in hidden corridors. That whispering darkness began to break in the 19th century. As Chapter 1 explained, Pope Leo XIII granted limited access. Scholars uncovered shocking truths. They published works on church trials. They exposed the church's blood-stained past. They debated whether the archive was a monument to intolerance or a testament to self-awareness. Their publications forced the church to confront its hidden history. But the files on heresy remained tightly controlled. Many requested copies were denied. Many topics were off-limits. At times, entire collections disappeared. Scholars spoke of boxes lost in transfer, of uncatalogued rooms, of doorways that led nowhere, and the legend of the archive's darkest wing grew. No one knows exactly what it holds. Some say it contains the surviving records of the Waldensians, heretical preachers nearly wiped out in the 13th century. Others speak of documents on early reformers like Wycliffe and Huss. Some insist the Vatican destroyed files rather than release them. Others claim they remain buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. In modern times, survivors of abuse and injustice have sought redress through these records. They petition the Vatican to search the archives for evidence. They ask for names, dates, documents. Some have found relief. Others meet silence. The Church maintains that privacy and confidentiality protect the innocent. Yet critics argue that secrecy shields the guilty. Despite these controversies, the archive stands as both vault and witness. It embodies the tension between knowledge and power, between truth and authority. Its corridors echo with the voices of the accused and the accusers. Its shelves hold tales of faith and fear, of conviction and cruelty, of judgment and mercy, or the lack of it. Every document on heresy reveals a moment of crisis, a choice between acceptance and exile, between compliance and resistance, between life and death. And every time the ink dried on those parchments, the Church sealed not just a document, but a legacy. Today, as scholars continue to press for access, the Church balances on a knife's edge. It must weigh its duty to preserve privacy against the demands of history. It must decide which documents to release and which to keep locked away. And it must face the fact that in these records lies the story of its own struggle with power. The Inquisition files in the Vatican Archive remain among the most controversial holdings. They show the Church at its most fearful and its most determined. They reveal how the guardians of faith can become its fiercest enemies. They remind us that words written in ink can ignite flames centuries later. In the silence of those hidden chambers, the past waits, bound in leather and parchment, tied with string, numbered by hand, waiting for the day when every secret will find its reader, when every confession will be heard, and when every accusation will face its reckoning. Until that day, the chains of secrecy hold tight. The doors remain locked, and the echoes of quills on parchment continue to whisper about heresy, ink, and chains. Chapter 3: Letters They Never Answered. A letter is a fragile thing, parchment folded, plea penned in haste, prayer wrapped in ink. Yet for centuries, letters to the Vatican piled up like snow against a frozen gate. Some came from kings, others from peasants. Some carried threats, others carried hope. Most were never answered. In the silent vaults beneath Rome, these letters rest untouched. They bear seals from distant lands. Some are cracked, some broken, some never opened. They whisper of dreams, desperation, rebellion, and the Vatican filed them all, then turned away. Not every secret in the archive comes from guilt. Some are born of silence, a silence that weighs heavier than condemnation. These are the ignored letters, the ones that waited for a reply that never came, the ones written by those who stood outside the gates, wondering if anyone inside would listen. One such letter was carried across storm-lashed seas. The sender was a king, its request a divorce. The man was Henry VIII. The year was 1527. The world stood on the edge of Reformation. Henry had written before, dozens of times. His pen moved across velvet paper under candlelight. He begged. He warned. He offered reasons soaked in politics and power. He needed an heir. He needed a new wife. But the Pope hesitated. The Church had rules, ancient and unyielding, and Henry was asking it to bend. The letters were sent to Rome. Some never arrived. Pirates, storms, or betrayal stole them along the way. Others reached the Vatican gates and were placed in a vault. There they remained. Some were read, others ignored. Some were copied, then sealed again. The replies, when they came, were slow. They danced around answers. They circled the truth. Inside the Vatican Archive, those original letters still exist. Tied with faded ribbon, numbered by hand. They tell a story not just of a king's desire, but of a church caught between duty and survival. Henry would go on to break away from Rome. England would split from the Catholic world. And the archive kept the letters, every word, every stamp, every line of ink that changed the course of history. But Henry was not alone. Centuries earlier, another voice cried out from silence, a young astronomer, a man staring at the stars, searching for patterns. His telescope pointed upward, while his fears crept inward. His name was Galileo. He wrote with clarity. He spoke with certainty. His discoveries defied the world's accepted truths. The earth moved, he said. The heavens turned not around man, but around something far more ancient. He believed the truth would set him free. But the truth, as the church saw it, was dangerous. Galileo sent letters. Letters to cardinals. Letters to bishops. Letters to the Pope himself. He explained. He apologized. He reasoned. But silence came first. Then a summons. Then a trial. The Vatican Archive holds the trail of that slow unraveling. There are notes in the margins of his letters. Comments from theologians. Edits from advisors. Crossed out lines where Galileo's words struck too close to heresy. And there are the replies, curt, calculated, careful. The Vatican feared what he represented. A man who trusted observation more than doctrine. A voice louder than tradition. After his condemnation, his letters were filed. Not burned, not destroyed, preserved, shelved. Forgotten by some, revered by others. Their presence in the archive is not just historical. It is symbolic, proof that even as the church silenced him, it could not erase him. Elsewhere in the archive, tucked in between papal bulls and diplomatic cables, lies a smaller box. Contains letters written by women, queens, mystics, mothers. Their words are less known, but no less desperate. One letter came from a queen in Spain. Her child was dying. She begged for a relic, a blessing, a sign from Rome. She wrote every day for weeks. There is no record of a reply. Another came from a village healer in France. She had been accused of heresy. Her neighbors claimed she spoke to angels. She pleaded for intervention. Her letter was never opened. Its seal remained unbroken for 300 years. When scholars found it, the paper was yellow and brittle. The ink had faded. Her name had disappeared from every other record. These were not high matters of state, not theological disputes. These were cries from the margins. People who looked to the church not as a throne, but as a sanctuary. And in their time of need, the door remained shut. The Vatican Archive became a graveyard for unanswered hope. But not every letter was ignored. Some were watched, filed, used. During the French Revolution, anti-clerical forces seized church lands and executed priests. Rome watched from afar. Secret letters arrived from bishops in hiding, from nuns escaping violence. They described blood on the altar, fires in the nave, desecration of relics. Some begged the Pope for protection. Others simply bore witness. The Vatican preserved them all. It said nothing publicly, but the archive swelled with testimony. These letters became a hidden history of persecution, preserved in silence. Scholars would not read them for centuries. When they did, they found human suffering wrapped in bureaucratic formality. Letters from war zones tell a similar story. In World War I and again in World War II, the Vatican received a flood of correspondence. Families wrote to find missing sons. Soldiers sent confessions before battle. Some begged the Pope to intervene. Others just wanted their last words recorded. A file from 1942 contains dozens of such letters from Jewish families across Europe. Some had converted. Others simply pleaded for mercy. They believed the Pope could stop the trains, stop the arrests, stop the deaths. The Vatican answered some. It offered prayers. It negotiated quietly behind closed doors. But in the archive, those letters rest as cold evidence. Proof of appeals that came too late, of replies that came too softly, of lives that ended while ink dried. Each envelope is a ghost. Each fold in the paper holds a breath that was never returned. Then there are the letters that were intercepted. Documents written by bishops who fell from favor. Warnings sent to Rome about corruption. Confessions that were too dangerous to be read aloud. These were often hidden within sealed packets, marked as sensitive, classified for centuries. A cardinal in the 1800s wrote about abuses within a seminary. His report was detailed. Names, dates, testimonies. He sent it to Rome. There is no record of any action taken, but his letter is in the archive, redacted in places. Marginal notes suggest it was read by at least 4 officials. Still, no one replied. Not every silence was accidental. Sometimes the church chose not to answer because answering meant acknowledging. An acknowledgement brought risk. Even in modern times, the pattern has remained. Petitions to open more sections of the archive go unanswered. Requests to release certain wartime files are met with delays. Scholars submit applications and wait years for approval. Many die before ever holding the documents they hope to study. But the letters remain. They remain in temperature-controlled vaults. In boxes with numbers, not names. In languages long forgotten. Latin, Aramaic, Polish, Dutch, Arabic. Some are smudged, others immaculate. all of them fragments of conversations that never truly happened. Some letters were so powerful they never needed a reply. One collection comes from African priests in the 20th century. They reported on colonial abuses, forced conversions, missionary exploitation. They asked the Vatican to intervene. The archive holds their words. Brave, unanswered. Another set of documents comes from South America. During the Dirty Wars, priests and nuns disappeared. Some were tortured, others killed. Families wrote to Rome. Human rights activists wrote. They begged the church to act. The Vatican remained silent, yet the archive quietly received those letters, filed them, hid them. To this day, their relatives search for answers, and they often begin with the archive, because it is there that the silence was made solid. There is a terrible beauty to these letters, a kind of stillness that settles when the ink stops flowing. Each one is a heartbeat frozen in time, a voice trapped behind glass. Some have been digitized. Others are still bound in leather folders. Scholars pore over them, not just for the history, but for the humanity. They look beyond dates and doctrines. They listen for voices long buried. They find a father pleading for his son, a nun asking for permission to bury the dead, a student writing about faith lost in the rubble of war. These are not just pages. They are testimonies. And the Vatican Archive, by keeping them, has preserved something more powerful than it intended. It preserved the unanswered. There is something haunting in that, because silence too is a choice. To ignore a letter is to judge it unworthy, to pretend it was never sent. But paper does not forget, nor does ink, and the archive remembers. Today, some of those letters are finally being read. Scholars decipher ancient scripts. They scan the handwriting. They trace the paths these messages traveled, from castles and cottages, from prison cells and palaces, and they wonder what might have changed if these letters had been answered. No one knows for certain, but the Vatican's decision to keep them, to hide them for centuries, then slowly release them, has created a legacy of questions, a record not of action, but of inaction. And in that space between message and reply, a different kind of history took root. One built not on declarations, but on silence. A history of hope unanswered. A history written in letters. A history sealed, stored, and forgotten until now. Chapter 4: The Pope and the Dictator. A city of marble and shadow held its breath in the 1920s. Europe was still scarred by war. Governments had fallen and risen again. In Rome, a fragile peace trembled beneath the weight of politics and ambition. At its center stood the Vatican, ancient and sovereign, watching a modern storm gather beyond its walls. Within its secret archives lay documents that traced every step of a journey neither holy nor simple. It was a journey marked by a handshake sealed in shadows, by silent agreements inked on papal stationery, and by the uneasy alliance between a church that claimed moral authority and a rising dictator who wielded brutal power. When Benito Mussolini marched on Rome in 1922, few in the world expected the church to reach for diplomacy. The man known as Il Duce had seized power with banners and black shirts. He spoke of national rebirth and ancient glory. He demanded recognition. The Vatican watched from its balconies as troops paraded down the Via della Conciliation. It knew that the young state at its doorstep could crush it or carve it out. Fear and pragmatism moved the church's hand. So did calculation. A new chapter of secrecy began that day. In the hidden corridors of the archives, files were prepared. Letters between cardinals and negotiators were drafted. They discussed concordats, tax exemptions, Catholic schools, and the Church's place in the new Italy. They measured each clause against doctrine and diplomacy. They weighed every concession, and they recorded every decision in minute detail. The Lateran Treaty was born from these secret negotiations. It resolved the long quarrel over Rome's status. It made Vatican City an independent state. It restored church property. It secured religious education. But beneath its formal text lay darker margins filled with compromise and uneasy acceptance. The archives hold drafts showing how the Church agreed to recognize Mussolini's government unconditionally. They reveal concerns about anti-clerical factions. They show how church negotiators warned of atheist propaganda in public schools. Pages of handwritten notes describe strategies to counter socialist agitation. And tucked between these papers are confidential memoranda assessing the moral cost of such deals. Archivists who saw them spoke of passages blacked out, names removed, sentences torn away. The true extent of the Church's concessions remained hidden in plain sight. A decade later, the shadow stretched beyond Italy. Across the Alps, another dictator rose. Adolf Hitler declared himself Chancellor of Germany in 1933. He claimed to restore order after economic collapse and social unrest. He spoke of national destiny and racial purity. The Church watched warily as stormtroopers marched in Nuremberg. It feared a clash of ideologies, and it feared what would become of its faithful under a regime that exalted the state above all else. Vaults beneath the Vatican filled with reports from nuncios in Berlin and Munich. Diplomatic cables described meetings with Nazi officials. They reported on church closures. They noted the arrest of priests. They cataloged the confiscation of religious schools. Archive files reveal private letters from cardinals urging caution. They warned of anti-Catholic policies. They urged Rome to speak out. And they show how those pleas were met with silence or vague statements. Public condemnation was muted. Private concern was real. The Church's diplomatic corps recorded every violation, then filed the reports and waited for orders. Some documents recount meetings between papal emissaries and Nazi envoys. They sought assurances that Catholic institutions would be respected. They negotiated the Reichskonkordat in 1933. It guaranteed church rights in Nazi Germany. It protected Catholic schools, youth organizations, and charitable bodies. But the archives reveal a grim irony. The treaty, intended to secure religious freedom, was used by the Nazis as propaganda. They claimed the Church's blessing. They claimed moral cover. The Vatican's secret files hold post-treaty analyses showing how bishops in Germany watched Catholic newspapers shut down and priests imprisoned. Yet the papal curia remained officially committed to its accord. War came in 1939. The Vatican's neutrality was declared. It positioned itself as a mediator. It offered to broker peace. It opened secret channels to both Allied and Axis powers. The archives hold coded messages sent through diplomats in Lisbon and Ankara. They contain evaluations of casualty figures and refugee flows. They describe clandestine efforts to secure visas for persecuted Jews and dissidents. Some files praise specific church figures for their bravery. Others note failures or betrayals. Every move was logged, every result assessed. and every action was measured against the fear of compromising the Church's sovereignty. Inside those vaults lie personal files on the Pope's wartime priorities. They include records of shipments of bread and medicine to bomb cities. They detail encrypted letters sent to family members of missing priests. They chronicle negotiations with generals from both sides. Archivists refer to entries marked with red crosses indicating high importance. They speak of documents reclassified overnight. They mention unmarked envelopes moved from one shelf to another. Such judicial rearrangements obscured the most sensitive operations. These papers reveal a church walking a tightrope between compassion and neutrality, between moral duty and institutional survival. After the war, the Vatican emerged unscathed physically, but the moral questions endured. The archives held proof of contacts with dictators. They contained evidence of silence in the face of genocide. Survivors and historians pressed for answers. The Church responded by commissioning internal inquiries. They scoured documents. They produced reports for the Pope's eyes only. And then they refiled them deeper into the vaults, away from prying historians. Some files were sealed for 50 years. Others were quietly removed. The true scope of Vatican actions during those years remained locked away. The Cold War added a new dimension to secrecy. The Church's stance against communism became a guiding doctrine. Vatican envoys engaged with fledgling regimes in Eastern Europe. They sent clandestine letters to underground bishops. They recorded the imprisonment of priests by communist governments. The archive expanded with courier notes, diplomatic pouches, messages hidden in newspapers. These records intersected with those from Mussolini and Hitler. They formed a continuous thread, the Vatican's secret diplomacy under authoritarian regimes. Its willingness to forego public denunciation in favor of back-channel negotiations. In the vaults lies one overlooked file marked only by a single digit. It contains detailed accounts of the Pope's private reflections on totalitarianism. The entries were written by a close aide. They describe late-night conversations in the Apostolic Palace. They reveal frustration at the Church's inability to speak out more forcefully. They express sorrow for victims of oppression. And they admit fear that speaking too loudly would invite reprisals against Catholics worldwide. These writings were never intended for public view, yet they survive in the archive untouched by time. Turning those pages, a scholar might feel the tension in every line, the struggle between the Church's moral mission and its institutional instincts, the conflict between the teachings of compassion and the demands of political reality. They would see how the Vatican measured its steps in fear and faith, how it balanced its spiritual authority against murderous regimes, how it often chose silence over outcry, diplomacy over denunciation. The legacy of these decisions lingers in modern debates over papal responsibility, in controversies over the Church's handling of refugees, in questions about its role in confronting dictators today. The secret archives are more than a record of past dealings. They are a mirror reflecting the Church's own anxieties. They show how a once unchallenged institution grappled with the unprecedented horrors of the 20th century. And so Chapter 4 ends not with resolution, but with question. What price did the Church pay for its deals with dictators? What moral debts still await repayment? The echo of quills on parchment continues to haunt those chambers. The files lie silent, but their words speak loudly. They remind us that faith and power are uneasy partners, that mercy and diplomacy can become dangerous bedfellows, that the search for survival can sometimes betray the very values one claims to defend. In the flickering lamplight of the secret archive, the past waits, bound in leather, cataloged in code, hidden by decree. And behind every document lies a choice made in fear, ambition, or conscience. The Pope and the Dictator once shook hands in darkness. Their legacies remain etched in ink, waiting for the world to read them at last. Chapter 5: Saints Who Never Were. The process begins with a rumor, a story whispered in the stone corridors of a monastery, a miracle recounted at the edge of a candle's glow, a death that felt too pure, too selfless, too holy to be ordinary. Soon that rumor finds its way into letters, then into investigations, then, if it survives scrutiny, into canonization. And yet, for every saint the Church has raised up, there are others who never made it. Others who waited, watched, prayed, and were silenced. Their names are buried not in churches, but in the secret archive. To declare a saint is to shape memory. It is to make a life into legend. And for the Vatican, it is also to control which stories survive and which vanish. Beneath the marble and gold of St. Peter's lies an entire chamber dedicated to candidates for sainthood who were denied. It is a quiet gallery of forgotten holiness, and its files tell stories the Church never intended to make public. Canonization is not quick. It begins with a formal inquiry. Witnesses are called, diaries examined, medical claims analyzed. The candidates' writings are reviewed for theological soundness. Every page, every sentence is tested. Not all survive that scrutiny. Inside the secret archive are rows of files marked with a simple code: causa non prosequenda, cause not to be pursued. These are the names that failed to pass, sometimes for reasons of doctrine, sometimes for politics, and sometimes for reasons no one ever wrote down. One file, thick with correspondence, tells the story of a priest in 17th century Naples. He was known for healing the sick, feeding the poor, and calming storms with prayer. After his death, pilgrims visited his grave. Flowers were said to bloom in winter. Children spoke his name in sleep. The local bishop began the beatification process. But in Rome, the tone shifted. Letters between theologians raised questions. There were rumors of association with a banned mystic sect. No evidence, just whispers. His cause was shelved. His name disappeared from liturgy. But the archive kept every report, every affidavit, every account of a life full of devotion and political inconvenience. Another folder reveals the story of a nun from Poland. Her visions were vivid. She wrote of fire and judgment, of divine mercy and suffering. Her community revered her. Her writings circulated quietly, but they also frightened some. There were claims that her visions encouraged disobedience to hierarchy. Her writings were labeled dangerous. Her canonization process was halted. Years later, her writings were re-examined. The tide had turned. What once was heresy became mysticism. But the original letters condemning her still exist in the archive. In the margins of one, a Vatican official had scribbled just 2 words: "Not now." The archive is filled with these pauses, these redirections, these silences. It is not a place of theological debate. It is a place of final decisions. Some names were lost not because of spiritual doubt, but because of timing. One candidate was a laywoman from Spain who defied the Franco regime. She was a devout Catholic, but her politics made her enemies. She was arrested, tortured, executed. Her letters from prison were filled with faith. Her defenders called her a martyr. But the Church, wary of appearing to endorse her political stance, declined to move forward. Her beatification was delayed. Her documents remain in a locked drawer. There is no official rejection.
No declaración.
Just silence, and a file marked confidential. The story of sainthood is not only about virtue, it is also about narrative. The Vatican understood that saints inspire. They shape culture. They draw pilgrims. And so the Church chose carefully. It elevated those whose lives fit the mold, those who upheld obedience, those who avoided scandal. Others, equally holy, equally devout, were not so lucky. There is a cabinet in the archive dedicated to causes suppressed during the Inquisition. Some of these were men and women burned for heresy, later reconsidered. Others were mystics whose writings conflicted with church teaching. Their causes were started, halted, reopened, halted again. One file tells of a young man who cared for plague victims in Milan. He lived in poverty. He gave his life to the sick. But after his death, it was discovered he had written letters questioning papal infallibility. His sanctity was never denied, but his words were enough to derail the cause. The papers sit quietly in a file stamped incomplete. Even among those who were beatified, the archive holds records of hesitation. Correspondence between cardinals debating whether a reported miracle met the necessary standard. Internal investigations into candidates' families. One folder contains a report that a candidate's brother was involved in criminal activity. The candidate was never implicated, but the cause was postponed for decades. These decisions were never announced. No statement was made. The public simply stopped hearing the name, and in the Vatican the file was stored. Another life judged worthy in private but unworthy in public. Then there are the causes that were actively erased. In one chilling instance, an entire beatification file was sealed indefinitely. The candidate was a bishop who had opposed fascism in the 1930s. He had sheltered refugees. He had preached against violence. But after his death, his writings were deemed politically dangerous. The Church, navigating alliances with various regimes, removed all mention of his cause. The archive contains fragments, letters from those he helped, witness statements from surviving parishioners, but the central dossier is missing. Scholars found a catalog number with no corresponding file, a blank space in the shelf, a missing saint. Not all files concern the rejection of sanctity. Some are darker still. There are cases where individuals were proposed for sainthood, only for hidden truths to emerge. A missionary in the Philippines was revered as a martyr. His cause moved quickly, but during review, the archive revealed earlier reports of abuse, allegations made by fellow missionaries, a bishop's confidential letter expressing concern. The cause was closed quietly. The public was never told why, but the archive held the answer. Another involved a woman in Africa who had founded a Catholic community. She was beloved by her people. Her story was gaining traction, but her diary, kept in a sealed file, included statements of pride, ambition, and mystical visions that church authorities deemed problematic. The tone did not fit the humble model. The cause was dropped. Her followers still light candles in her name, but her sanctity remains undocumented. In these moments, the archive reveals not just who the church venerates, but who it fears. Not every suppression is permanent. Some candidates wait decades. A few are rediscovered. A nun once accused of hysteria is now recognized as a pioneer of Christian psychology. A martyr once dismissed as politically troublesome is now considered a symbol of resistance. But each resurrection begins with a descent into the archive. A scholar must first find the box. A box that may not be labeled. A file that may be coded. A set of pages that might be hidden in a drawer beneath others meant to distract. And even then, permission must be granted. The Vatican does not open these files freely. Access requires approval, credentials, purpose, and sometimes patience that outlasts lifetimes. In one case, a researcher spent 20 years petitioning to see a cause file from the 1800s. When finally granted access, he found a folder of 26 pages. 6 were blank. 5 were redacted. What remained painted a portrait of a mystic caught between divine ecstasy and doctrinal error. Her visions had terrified local clergy. The church never denied her sanctity, but it never embraced her either. That folder remains in the archive. Its presence speaks louder than any proclamation. The archive holds the dreams of saints who never were. Their stories are not carved in marble or sung in hymns. They are penciled in the margins, folded into envelopes, scribbled in trial records, and sometimes never written at all. But in those locked rooms, beneath layers of dust and discretion, they endure. A file from the 1500s includes a final note from a bishop who had petitioned for a local martyr to be canonized. The petition was denied. His note, barely legible, reads as a prayer, not for approval but for remembrance. And that is what the archive does. It remembers. It remembers the woman who nursed plague victims, the man who questioned authority, the girl who sang to the dying, the priest who preached peace. Their sainthood was denied, but their lives remain. And so, while the church lifted some up as models of perfection, it buried others in bureaucratic silence. The secret archive is their only shrine. Today, debates continue. Some call for a more open canonization process. Others urge caution. But no one denies that the past holds many names unspoken, and many more once spoken, now forgotten. As historians trace the lives of the forgotten, they rely on the archive's quiet testimony. It does not lie, but it does conceal, protects not just doctrine but dignity, and sometimes shame. In those long corridors, under artificial lights and watchful eyes, the files wait. They wait for someone to ask again, to read again, to remember, because sainthood is not just about miracles or martyrdom. It is about whose voice is heard and whose silence is recorded. In the next chapter, we will descend deeper into the realm of prophecy, revelation, and forbidden visions, into secrets that not even saints could see. But for now, let us pause with the ones who almost were. The saints who walked the path but never reached the altar, whose light flickered in the shadows, and whose stories, though buried, still shine in silence. Chapter 6: The Prophets and the Apocalypse. There is a silence in the deepest wing of the Vatican secret archives that does not come from dust or age. It is the silence of withheld warnings, the silence of words never meant to be read aloud. For centuries, visions have haunted the Church, not just stories of saints and miracles, but dire prophecies of the world's end, apocalyptic letters, cryptic dreams, fragments of revelation written by trembling hands in candlelit cells. The Church has always feared madness disguised as holiness, feared what a prophecy could spark. A single sentence, if believed, could move armies or bring empires to collapse. And so, when such visions surfaced, they were collected, quietly, systematically, removed from public eyes and stored beneath keys and codes. There, in the most restricted corners of the archive, the end of the world sleeps, written not in thunder but in ink. The tradition of prophecy runs deep in the Church's past. In every century, someone claimed to hear the divine speak. Some claimed to see fire rain from the sky. Others described beasts rising from oceans. Some warned of popes who would betray the faith. Others foretold a final war between heaven and hell. Many of these visions were dismissed as delusions, but a few were taken seriously, too seriously, and once that happened, their words vanished from public record. One of the most guarded folders in the entire archive bears no title, only a symbol, a 7-pointed star. Inside are the transcripts of a cloistered nun from 1698. She lived in France. She never left her convent, and yet her visions reached Rome. She described the fall of kings, the collapse of cities. She claimed the Church itself would split in 3, each part devouring the others. Her words were feverish but precise. She named years. She drew maps of floods and fires. Her superior, terrified by what she heard, sent the writings to Rome. The nun died shortly after, no cause ever recorded. Her convent was disbanded. Her name was erased from the rolls, but her visions remained, locked in a drawer, never published, never acknowledged. That drawer is still there. The ink has faded, but the pages remain intact. Some are written in a cipher, others in Latin overlaid with symbols. Marginal notes in different hands show that multiple officials studied the texts. They annotated, debated, tried to interpret. In one spot, 3 entire pages are burned along the edges. No explanation is given. What remains is chilling. Images of angels holding scales, cities drowning in red, stars falling like cinders. Not far from that drawer lies a wooden box, heavier than most. Inside are reports from the 19th century. A priest from Portugal had begun preaching about a coming age of darkness. He claimed the Virgin had appeared to him and revealed 3 secrets. The first was about the rise of atheism. The second spoke of a war that would begin in Europe and spread like a plague. The third, however, was never revealed. The priest sent the full account to the Vatican. When Rome responded, it asked for silence. The priest obeyed. His parishioners never knew why he stopped speaking. He died a year later. His letters and the third secret were archived. Decades later, a different vision would echo that same structure. In 1917, 3 children in Fatima claimed to receive 3 secrets from the Virgin. The first 2 were eventually released. The third remained sealed for decades. Popes read it in private. Some wept. Others remained silent. When it was finally published, controversy erupted. Many believed the full contents had not been revealed. The Vatican insisted otherwise, but researchers note that other documents from Fatima remain restricted, stored far from the published pages, possibly containing additional context or contradictions. The archives also house suppressed prophetic texts from earlier centuries, apocryphal gospels, writings attributed to apostles long dead. Some speak of Christ returning in secret. Others claim the Antichrist was already born, disguised as a bishop. These texts were condemned, yet preserved. The Church denied their truth but feared their influence. Burning them would raise questions. Hiding them was safer. In the late 1300s, a lay preacher in Florence began drawing crowds with sermons of fire and ruin. He claimed he had been shown the last pope, the one who would abandon the cross and wear the crown of Caesar. He preached of cities buried beneath ash. He said the judgment would come not from heaven, but from within the church itself. His followers wrote down everything. Rome took notice. A delegation was sent. The man was arrested. His writings were confiscated. Those confiscated texts are now in a locked cabinet. Scholars who read them under special supervision describe a strange mixture of poetry and prediction. Lines that shift in meaning, warnings that seem to match historical events long after they were written. Some in the Vatican feared the documents gave legitimacy to later claims of schism and reform. Others worried the predictions might still be used by fringe movements, and so the texts remained buried. There are even records of internal visions, prophecies seen by members of the church hierarchy. A bishop in the 1800s reported dreams of a dark conclave, cardinals clawing at each other in the Sistine Chapel, a vote that brought a false pope to power. He recorded his dreams in a personal diary, which was later seized by papal order. The Vatican never confirmed the bishop's fate, but his diary sits in a sealed envelope marked only with his name and the word confidential. More recently, the archives contain documents from the Cold War. In the 1960s and 70s, as nuclear fear gripped the world, letters flooded the Vatican from seers, mystics, and doomsday cults. Some claimed to have seen mushroom clouds over Rome. Others described papal assassinations. The Vatican responded to none of them, but it kept them, filed them. Some were clearly delusional, others eerily accurate. One chilling folder contains intelligence reports from the late 1980s. It details the infiltration of certain Catholic groups by apocalyptic sections. These groups claimed to receive hidden messages during Massachusetts. Some believed the Pope himself was under demonic influence. They wrote elaborate prophecies. The Vatican studied them not to validate but to monitor. The documents include psychological assessments, surveillance summaries, even coded responses from bishops who tried to de-escalate the groups quietly. The archives do not just store prophecy. They manage it. They decide when and if a vision becomes part of church teaching, and when it remains a personal revelation, locked away forever. There are guidelines for this. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith outlines the process. Visionaries are interviewed. Medical experts are consulted. Theological panels review the content. But behind every official process is an unofficial one. A layer of secrecy, a fear that a single mistaken revelation might fracture faith itself. The archives section on Marian apparitions is vast. For every approved vision, Lourdes, Fatima, Guadalupe, there are dozens never recognized. Each has its own file. Some are thin, just a few pages. Others stretch into volumes. Investigations, testimonies, photos, translations. Many were dismissed for lack of evidence. Some were rejected for sounding too political. Others were simply forgotten. And then there are those deemed too dangerous. One file recounts a reported apparition in Eastern Europe during the 1930s. The message was simple. The church must cleanse itself or be destroyed. The visionary was a teenage boy. He disappeared within weeks of his final vision. His family was later excommunicated. The documents were transferred to Rome. No explanation was ever offered. But within the archive, the full investigation remains. Unreleased, unreferenced, real. Another set of files includes messages reportedly received during exorcisms. Some priests recorded these messages and sent transcripts to the Vatican. Many were ignored, but others triggered concern, especially those that predicted the fall of Rome or the rise of a false church. These messages were never published. They were collected, analyzed, and stored with extreme caution. The church has always drawn a careful line. Faith is built on mystery, but mystery must not lead to chaos. Prophecies can unite or destroy. They can strengthen belief or fracture it. And so the Vatican chose caution, kept the prophecies, but it buried them deep. Today, only a handful of living scholars have seen the full extent of the archive's apocalyptic material. They describe it not as a prophecy room, but as a gallery of fear. Fear of losing control, fear of being wrong, fear of unleashing something that cannot be put back. Because once a prophecy is public, it lives beyond the church's walls. It becomes fuel for cults, for rebellion, for hope or despair. And the Vatican understands that too well. That is why some pages are smudged, some files misplaced, some words crossed out by shaking hands. Not to deceive, but to delay, to postpone a reckoning no one is ready to face. In a world spinning faster than ever, the allure of prophecy grows stronger. People still write to the Vatican, still describe their dreams, still beg the Pope to reveal the final secret. And the Church, ever cautious, receives the letters, reviews the claims, and, more often than not, files them in silence. They join the others, the visions of fire and ruin, the dreams of salvation, the warnings no one heard. In that silence, the archive listens, and it waits for the end that may or may not come, for the last prophecy to be written, or the first to come true. Chapter 7: Cracks in the Walls. A new light filters through the cracks. It is not the golden glow of stained glass. It is pale, digital, relentless. The world has changed. Scholars tap screens instead of turning pages. Requests for secret files arrive by email. Archives once sealed by iron doors now face pressure from courts, activists, and the internet. And the Vatican faces its greatest test yet. The archives tremble not from age, but from demand. In recent decades, the Church has gradually opened selected sections. Files on early papal correspondence, diplomatic letters from the Renaissance, documents on medieval councils. These releases arrived in measured drips. They were celebrated by historians hungry for fresh insight and by the faithful who sought transparency. Yet each new tranche came with caveats. Access was granted only to the academically credentialed. Materials remained under scrutiny. Sensitive names were redacted. Some boxes stayed locked, their catalog numbers visible but contents forbidden. Technology has accelerated the process. High-resolution scanners capture fragile manuscripts without handling. Digital catalogs list titles, dates, and brief summaries. Researchers in distant cities can request scans and study them on their own screens. The Vatican has invested in this infrastructure, careful to retain control. Servers sit in secured rooms. Access logs record every click. Even as the archive releases thousands of pages, it monitors who reads them and what they download. Public pressure has forced deeper cracks. Families of wartime victims demand files on church wartime policies. Survivors of abuse seek records that could expose perpetrators. Human rights organizations file freedom of information requests. Courts in Italy and beyond issue subpoenas. The Vatican push and the Vatican pull now mark every page toward greater openness. Yet the Church insists on spiritual confidentiality. It argues that pastoral letters, internal communications, and personal testimonies require protection. The battle plays out quietly in meetings behind the loggia. Leaks have tested the Church's defenses. In recent years, whistleblowers smuggled images of sealed documents onto the internet. Lines of text describing secret agreements with authoritarian regimes, lists of clergy accused of misconduct, and eyewitness accounts of forced conversions appeared on forums. The Vatican responded with warnings and appeals to return stolen materials. It threatened canonical sanctions, but it also quietly reviewed the leaked documents, assessing whether to release them officially or to reinforce the lock. Amid this turmoil, prominent historians have formed advisory councils. They include archivists, theologians, legal experts, and technologists. They debate criteria for release. They argue over redactions, publication formats, and preservation standards. Some push for full, unedited publication. Others warn that certain documents could endanger living individuals. The Church listens but moves slowly. It has announced future plans to open the files of popes who died more than 80 years ago. That promise has become a rolling horizon, always shifting, always awaited. A recent triumph emerged when the archives released thousands of pages on diplomatic relations during the First World War. These documents shed new light on Vatican mediation efforts, refugee assistance, and the Church's stance on emerging nation-states. Researchers praised the release as groundbreaking. Yet they noted that sections on the Holy See's internal debates and its interactions with emerging totalitarian movements remained sealed. The joy of discovery was tempered by the awareness that more questions lay beneath the unopened cabinets. Then came the digitalization project. Volunteers and interns began tagging and indexing names, places, events. They created searchable databases that connect correspondence, highlight recurring themes, and cross-reference dates. The archive evolved from a passive repository to an active research platform. But every convenience brought new dilemmas. Automated redaction tools sometimes over-censored, stripping innocuous names alongside sensitive ones. Metadata scraped by third parties raised privacy concerns. The Church confronted the paradox of digital preservation, making knowledge accessible without losing control. In parallel, grassroots initiatives formed to crowdsource transcriptions. Amateur historians and genealogists collaborated online to read faded scripts and decode 18th century handwriting. Social media groups sprung up, sharing findings and debating interpretations. Some discovered lost letters from persecuted minorities. Others pieced together narratives of hidden martyrs. The Vatican watched these developments warily. It had encouraged public engagement, but not at the cost of unpredictability or defamation. It reinforced rules on attribution and copyright, reminding participants that ownership of those pages still lay in Vatican hands. Legal challenges escalated in civil courts. Claimants cited international human rights conventions to press for access to files on wartime collaborations and institutional abuse. National laws offered limited leverage against a sovereign state. Yet moral pressure weighed heavily. The Vatican negotiated settlements in private, agreeing to partial disclosures. These compromises often involved paywalled archives or limited-time exhibitions. Critics pointed out that true transparency could not be conditional. But the Church defended its right to balance openness with pastoral care. Today, the archives stand at a crossroads. Deep in their vaults lie files that no amount of digitalization can reach without explicit permission. The suppressed visions of apocalyptic nuns, the unsent pleas of condemned reformers, the redacted margins of saint-making dossiers. Each box still carries the weight of centuries of silence. Yet every crack, technological, legal, ethical, generational, widens the path toward revelation. Scholars prepare for the day when those final doors swing open. They write proposals, draft syllabi, organize conferences. They imagine telling the full story of institutional choices, moral failures, and hidden courage. They believe that history demands not only what was recorded, but what was withheld. They see the secret archive not as a monument to power, but as a mirror of human complexity. The Vatican knows this too. It has begun to frame new narratives about repentant release, about the virtue of discretion, about the sacred duty of memory. It insists that some secrets protect the vulnerable, preserve confidentiality, and guard the sanctity of personal conscience. It appeals to the faithful to trust its judgment. But the world beyond Rome has grown impatient. In the cold, humming servers beneath the palace, a final question lingers. Will the archive break open in full, or will it remain a fortress of selective illumination? The answer rests on decisions still to be made by popes, by curial officials, by scholars, and by those who hold the keys. The cracks in the walls are no longer small. Light streams in from every direction, and with each beam of illumination, the archive's shadows shrink. One day, perhaps, every document will see the sun. Until then, those who seek the hidden past continue to chip away at the silence, determined to let every secret find its voice.